All right, here we go. Good morning from San Diego, California, and good afternoon and evening to everyone around the world who's attending today. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Dreaming of a New Collections Management System. For those who are just joining us in this series, my name is Alex Kron, and I am the Digital Projects and Collections Specialist for the Balboa Park Online Collaborative, a nonprofit technology consultancy based out of San Diego, California. Our CEO, Nik Honeysett, is also here as my co-host. We are coming back from a short break, but from November and through February, we have had monthly live discussions around challenges that gallery, library, archive, and museum professionals face in managing their collections data and collections management systems with a focused lens for each session. Now, today's episode will be focusing on a highly requested topic. Folks asked and we heard you. In previous sessions, a number of comments and questions have come up around addressing DEAI challenges in collections. So our discussion today will focus on DEAI, or diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion challenges and opportunities in managing collections and collections data. Now, while BPOC has helped to organize and promote this discussion, we will be stepping back from this conversation in order to amplify the voices of the professionals invited here, share their experiences. We kindly ask that our attendees remain respectful to our panelists and fellow colleagues in the chat. So how does this topic relate to our series? Challenges around DEAI have been lightly touched upon in our previous sessions. Some of the challenges that have been pointed out include documenting objects with appropriate cultural representation, detailing their context within the cultures which they come from, and implementing NAGPRO practices. Today's discussion will touch on these and more. After each panelist has had a chance to speak, we will read off questions and comments in the chat from everyone. So now please welcome our panelists today. We have Kara Vetter, Director of Cultural Resources at the Museum of Us here in San Diego, California. First, I must congratulate her as the newly elected board member of the Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists. Now, as the Director of Cultural Resources, she oversees all functions related to the stewardship of nearly 500,000 cultural resources acquired from Indigenous communities worldwide. This work includes ensuring compliance with federal NAGPRA law and supporting the museum's decolonizing principles through the development of culturally sensitive approaches to registration and cultural resources stewardship that honor and incorporate Indigenous traditional knowledge and cultural care practices in all aspects of stewardship. Welcome, Kara. Next, we have Nicole Allen White, the Interim Deputy Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Access, and Director of Government and External Affairs at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. As the Director of Government Affairs, she manages the museum's government relations for city, state, and federal initiatives, and works cross-departmentally to advance the museum's community engagement activities. She is also serving as the museum's Interim Deputy Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Access, where she is establishing and leading the museum's comprehensive DEIA strategy. Next, we have Mikka G. Conway, the Chief Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Officer and EEO Director at the National Gallery of Art. Mikka is the National Gallery of Art's first senior level officer dedicated to advancing DEAI, working across the museum to develop systemic, sustainable change in support of a more diverse, equitable, accessible, and inclusive institution. She's worked in the museum field for more than 20 years as a curator, manager, assistant director, and more recently as Associate General Counsel of the J. Paul Getty Trust, where she advised on intellectual property, privacy, tax, and other matters, and was a founding member of the Getty's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. Now, first, why don't we start with Kara? Why don't you share some of your experiences with us today?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your days to be here with us. So before I share about the work that the Museum of Us is undertaking, I would actually like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The Museum of Us, we recognize that we have the privilege to reside on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Kumeyaay Nation. These are the Indigenous peoples of this area. The Kumeyaay peoples have lived in this area since time immemorial, and the Kumeyaay Nation maintained their political sovereignty, cultural traditions, and they are the stewards of this land. This is a typical land acknowledgement that we give at the beginning of most of our meetings in order to acknowledge the people whose lands on which we reside. So the Museum of Us, we are a cultural anthropology museum that was founded in 1915 for the Panama, California Exposition. It was part of several attractions that were purpose-built for Balboa Park. It's kind of like Central Park, Southern California style, essentially, and it's quite beautiful. And for the original expo, we collected from dozens of Indigenous communities, both domestically and internationally. And during the following 100 years, we collected even more from more than 200 Native American communities from within the United States, and then more than 250 Indigenous communities internationally. We really took this collection, thing to heart. And since we're talking CMS today, I thought I'd share a little bit about further details about our cultural resources demographics to give some context to the conversations moving forward. So our holdings include more than 375,000 ethnographic and archaeological cultural resources, more than 100,000 images and 300 linear feet of archival material, all of which have some Indigenous component for the most part, be it subject matter or actual people. And then we do steward over 7,500 ancestral human remains. Some of these are Native American remains and are subject to federal NAGPRA law, which is a process we are working through with the communities. And others are Indigenous internationally. So some are Peruvian, Indigenous Peruvians, and some still require further review to understand the cultural context. And the reason we have so many ancestral human remains is because for the 1915 Expo, there was a particular anthropologist, a physical anthropologist named Alex Kron, who was charged with kind of creating exhibits about the races of man. And he was a known eugenics, I said that wrong, known eugenicist, and a kind of believer in white supremacy. So that is why we have so many ancestors, because he truly believed and studied in the disparity and the differences of the races. So that's why we have so many ancestors that we have to figure out how to repatriate. So given that the majority of our holdings are from Indigenous communities, we have a lot of work to do to ensure that we are complying with our guiding principles of decolonizing initiatives. And I have to say that DEAI work is not something that we just flipped into overnight. It is a long and deliberate process. And it's one that started really about 7 or 8, all going on 10 years ago, when we began to reassess what our work has been to date under federal NAGPRA law. And in particular, it was around us listening to our local Native American communities who had been demanding for decades the repatriation of their ancestors and belongings from not only us, but from other institutions. As we know, NAGPRA law, it's been around for 30 years now, and communities are still having to fight to get their ancestors and their belongings repatriated. And so through us, actually, we were compliant with the law, but not necessarily always following the spirit of the law. And NAGPRA law can really be weighted in the side of museums, because the museums are the ones who can set cultural determination. And I won't go too much deeper into it, but there's some links available, I believe, that I shared with Alex, that people can kind of look at NAGPRA law and what that's like. So through this kind of process of us actually opening ourselves up and listening, and we call it ceding authority, and having that honest consultation with community about what they need and how we needed to be doing better, we started to see just how transformative decolonized initiatives can truly be. And through some of these early steps, we began to take a look at not only how we work with Indigenous communities, but also some of our higher level, or actually all of our higher level policies around DEAI work, and how decolonizing initiatives can and should touch every level of our operational processes. And so I will also say that this was a pretty long process of acceptance by our board and our leadership. Again, this isn't something that we just said we're doing it and off we went. It was a process that we had to work through, and there was some fear and there was some hesitancy about how changing how we operated would affect the museum long term. And change is scary, but a lot of times that came out in fear. That was questions of like, well, what will we display if there's less to show? And the answer to that is museums don't display everything they hold anyway. It's not possible. So, and another fear was, well, will they take everything? And they being Indigenous communities. And we were like, well, if that is what the Indigenous community requires, then that's what we need to do to uphold our end of being a truly decolonizing institution. So we know that that's not going to happen in the end. There are many communities that cannot accept their cultural resources back or do not want them back for a variety of reasons. So we will still have plenty of cultural resources to utilize. And the goal is to have cultural resources within our holdings that are here with consent. That is the primary goal. And so how long this will take and how much will it cost was another question. And to that is it costs time, money, and effort to collect these cultural resources. So it's going to take time, money, and energy to ensure that consultation is occurring and so that we know that what we have is here with consent. And one thing that really helped us with that process of talking with our board and kind of getting board buy-in, because we needed to get it at the higher level and filter it through, was building case studies about how the cultural resources that we steward came into our museum via a variety of pathways. We call them colonial pathways, and there's another link that will be available. And really, these case studies were taking a deep dive into the acquisition paperwork and saying, well, how did this happen? And a lot of these stories are truly painful, truly atrocious. And by bringing that pain of colonial activity that was perpetrated upon Indigenous communities into light, and then diving into that pain and working with the board members through that, it became pretty obvious to quite many of them that the work is actually valuable and it's necessary in order to see the museum through the next phase of what it means to be a museum in the 21st century. And I will say that some board members did not agree with all of the directions that we were going, and some of them did transition off. And then that's okay, that you do have to break a few eggs sometimes in order to make an omelet, and that by those folks going off and new folks coming on, we were able to start to build a board that had a broader perspective, more experience in different areas, and help us build a more holistic approach to board building. We still definitely need more BIPOC representation. It's an area we're still lacking, but what we're really looking to do is create an environment that is hospitable and welcoming to all people, especially BIPOC folks at the leadership level and throughout our institution. So that's a little bit about like the history of how we kind of got to where we are. It wasn't an easy process, and we still hit stumbling blocks along the way, but it's a process that we are committed to. So for us, working through decolonizing initiatives with like a lenses of DEAI and social justice and all these other works that are going through, compliance means that we kind of have to examine everything through what we call our 4 guiding principles. And these guiding principles were actually kind of created, or at least brought to light, by Ho-Chunk scholar Dr. Amy Lonetree, and she wrote the seminal work Decolonizing Initiatives. So her work is what is really guiding us through a lot of our earlier days and now. And so some of these guiding principles, these 4, are around truth-telling and accountability. So this is about the museum reckoning with our oppressive history and our colonial legacy, and what our current colonial and decolonial practices and policies are. Rethinking ownership, specifically not just physical ownership, but thinking about Indigenous intellectual and cultural property rights, both tangible and intangible. So the digital realm is becoming a much larger thing that we have to really address. We're also looking through an organizational cultural shift that is supported by policies. So we've had a lot of internal language shifts. You might notice that I don't say artifact or thing, I say cultural resource. That is a term that is generally accepted by most Indigenous communities as being an acceptable term when referring to an item that belongs to or it came from an Indigenous community. It also, this cultural shift impacts every level of our institution through operations and organizational practices, as well as a lot of our policies that we're creating. So you can see on our website that we have a curation of human remains policy that came up a few years ago that really guides how we steward ancestral human remains when they are either in storage or in a repository or willow storage space, and also if if they should be on display at all. It's all about informed consent. And then we have a colonial pathways policy, which outlines the ways in which cultural resources could have come to the institution, the variety of pathways that could be, and that was based on a lot of our case study work. And then there's also how these cultural resources can thank you, Alex, for that link. There's a policy that talks about how these cultural resources can leave our care after consultation with community, especially if it's outside of the bounds of NAGPRA law. This cultural shift is really about centering and honoring tribal sovereignty and Indigenous voice, and basically all needs around the aspects of their cultural resources. And then the final principle is through representation, ensuring that we are having BIPOC representation in all levels of the decision-making process. There's plenty of room for growth in all of these guiding principles, but they really do help us examine whenever a new project is coming up, or if we're taking a look back at what we've done in the past, we look at it through these lenses. So now that I've kind of brain dumped a lot of information about decolonizing initiatives or DI work issue, I kind of want to bring in CMSs into the conversation, since that's kind of what we're here to talk about. So I'll get into the nitty gritty, because I do work with our database on a daily basis. And so our museum, we use collection space or C-space, and it really does fit a lot of the needs that we have for day-to-day work, which is fantastic. We transitioned in 2015. It was actually my primary project when I came on at the museum. And it's really helped us deal with a lot of our old dirty data from the last 20 years of really improper use of past perfect and using other ad hoc information systems. And so how DI work flows into our CMS C-space work right now, and it ranges. It can be super complex to really basic. So one basic example is, and it's super basic, it's ensuring that images in our database, if they are associated with a cultural resource that may have been deemed sensitive by an Indigenous community through consultation, we remove that image and we put a placeholder image that is, restricted, and then we move that image to a restricted space on our server, and then we put notes in appropriate fields that say why that image is removed, and if there needs to be other language that has to occur, we do it in that way. And it is a very basic thing to do, but it is time consuming, and so that's something that we have to account for when we're working through the consultation process and building in our workflows. A more complex example could be when we're working to do an inventory project and we're updating cultures associated with cultural resources. We always want to use the preferred culture community of origin name. And I know, again, that seems pretty basic, but when you understand that many communities' names as we know them today were actually assigned by colonial powers. So they're in their identity and their cultural affiliation was erased for many years, or it was misattributed. And so by reclaiming that identity with a corrected culture name in our CMS, it's actually a huge step in recognizing Indigenous sovereignty. And where the additional layers of DI come into it is that we wish to kind of have to keep a record of those old names and those incorrect or honestly sometimes offensive culture names, because we have to keep it for our historical truth-telling purposes. You don't want to just erase it and say, oh, we fixed it. We need to make sure we retain at least some record of it so that we can come back to it and make sure we're keeping ourselves accountable. So with our database, we're really lucky, and I know not all databases can do this, but we can set preferred and non-preferred culture names so that if you're typing in an incorrect name, you kind of get a prompt to pick the correct one. Now, this only works if you have the right culture names and everything's tiered correctly within the system, which does require additional rounds of cleanup that is often not able to be done day to day, but it is something that we're working to address. So those are some examples of just basic and more complex workflows that we have to work through with our CMS. Moving into what I think are potentially some limitations and opportunities for CMSs. And I will say that I only have an experience with a handful of CMSs, so please do take my comments broadly. But I see that CMSs can meet the challenge of the 21st century, but here are a few limitations. So I think a primary one, at least from my perspective, is these systems were designed before the reckoning that museums are currently in. They were designed in the 20th century. So they were, and they modeled like Dewey Decimal systems of, so they go further back. And so since their focus is really on categorization and systemization of data, and especially from a Western perspective, they often don't have natural places to incorporate a space for traditional knowledge of Indigenous communities, a space to talk about what those Indigenous access protocols are for the cultural resources or for other information from an Indigenous perspective. So I've kind of found that CMS users kind of have to determine the best placement for this information, and then they have to ensure that standardization of use, which you have to do with all CMSs anyway, because if you put the information in, that's great, but if you don't put it in the right place, it's not terribly usable. So that's kind of a challenge that is kind of a standard operating issue with CMSs, is proper placement of information. I think another limitation is that is the CMS's ability to track NACPRA compliance. I know that some systems do it better than others, and some don't do it at all. And I think that's really one area of growth for maybe creating within the systems kind of one-stop shops for how data is managed through the compliance process, from the first request for consultation all the way to repatriation, and all the documentation that is created within. So I think that there's a great opportunity there, or a opportunity there. An additional opportunity would be working through repatriation of digital and physical data. So many communities, Indigenous communities, we're starting to hear, especially now that they're becoming more connected with the internet and having more access and having just more experience with digital technology, is wanting some or all iterations of records associated with their ancestors and their cultural resources to be repatriated in some way, shape, or form. NAGPRA law doesn't necessarily cover this. It's a gray area. And so I think how museums comply with these requests is kind of scattershot. So having something in a CMS that might help prompt, those conversations would be really helpful. Also, another opportunity is around defining access for Indigenous and non-Indigenous users. So I know there's a couple systems out there. In particular, there's Mukatu, which is pretty fantastic at defining access and protocols. And it is an amazing piece of software that can really, I think, revolutionize a lot of these questions that are being brought up. But I will also say that it is often utilized as a secondary CMS that kind of layers over the top of an institution's primary CMS. So for those that are not able to incorporate the second system, if it's possible for their existing primary CMS to start having fields built in to help them incorporate access protocols, I think would be really helpful. So not to kind of come to a screeching halt, but I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for my colleagues to talk. But really, I just see that the future is really bright for CMSs and institutions as a whole through decolonizing and DEAI work, but we've got a lot of colonial baggage to unpack around CMSs, and not only with the data that's being collected, but also ensuring that we are collaborating with communities around how data is stewarded and how CMSs can build functionalities to reflect Indigenous needs. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Thank you, Kara. I mean, wow, the level of thought and strategy that has gone into your work is incredible. So thank you for sharing that. Next, Nicole, why don't you share with us some of the work that you have been doing at your institution?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Kara. It's so amazing to hear you speak about your work. I represent the Philadelphia Museum of Art. As Alex mentioned in my bio, I am our Interim Deputy Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Access. I am the first person who is leading this office. The office was established in the office was approved by our Board of Trustees in June of 2020, and then officially established in September 2020. And so I have been leading it in this interim year. Regularly, I serve as our Director of Government and External Affairs at the museum within our executive office. And in that capacity, I have worked on a number of issues related to DEIA because as I see my position, my regular position, as I call it, that it really is about being a civic institution. We are a major municipal museum that receives funding from the city and fortunately also from state and federal resources. And I truly believe that in order to justify that funding, that you really need to be accountable to the citizens who are funding it. And that looks, that means Philadelphians. And Philadelphia is a city that is majority people of color, 45% African-American or Black. And so we as a museum really need to represent our community and on a most basic level to justify the funding that we receive. So that has really been the eye or the framing with which I have always viewed my position within the organization. So I've worked on a number of issues related to DEIA over the years, including serving as our co-chair of our interim African-American art working group and helping to put together a number of grants related to creating a more comprehensive DEIA strategy. So when we established the office, I was able to step in and to use a lot of the strategies that we had been employing in various capacities and building on various projects that I've worked on to employ this more comprehensive strategy around the museum. And really, touching on, it needs to touch on every single aspect of what we do. If we're going to, as Kara said, decolonize, as we were talking yesterday, I admitted to the group that I think I might be a bit of a pessimist, but I'm not sure how much our museums, specifically our major art municipal museums such as the PMA, can truly become decolonized or be an anti-racist organization. I don't tend to use those words because I think it actually sets us up for failure. I think this country has been built on racism. It's inherent in almost any and every structure within the country. So until the country becomes anti-racist, I find it very difficult to believe that our museums will be so, especially given the history that they're built on. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't, that there isn't work to be done towards that end, certainly so. And that's what we continue to do. And that's what I'm leading within our museum. And that begins with, I hate to say, your typical training program, but it's really just getting people comfortable with speaking about topics such as race, ethnicity, and equity that we are uncomfortable with speaking about. And that's not, because we're museum professionals, that's because that's what this country has created, is structures where we don't talk about it so that the structures and the systems can continue to perpetuate themselves. And so my approach is always, if we want change, then we have to actually make change. So when situations come up, I think, okay, what would we normally do? Well, let's not do that, and let's do something else. And we will certainly have missteps along the way, but as long as you're seen as growing and learning from that, in whatever capacity that is, even if it's, understanding you can have a conversation about an issue that you would tend to shy away from, that's important. So, we just adopted a statement of principles for diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, which, it's a wonderful experience to adopt this statement. But I think what I'm most proud of is that it really is a forward, that for one, it acknowledges the history of exclusion that our own museum has taken part in. And that goes to, as Kara spoke about, with Dr. Amy Lonetree, that truth-telling and accountability, you have to do that as the first step, but then also look forward and what are we going to do next? And that's about setting measurable, actionable goals for how we can affect change within our organization. And so that's the work that still needs to really get done in earnest. But I'm really trying to lay the foundation within this interim year to make it so that we are in a position to really, get down to work and make some big commitments and some shifts within our own processes and policies and structures to become a more inclusive organization at the end of the day.
Thank you, Nicole. Mikka, you want to share with us a little bit?
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Kara. There's not, I feel like on one level, there's not a lot more for me to say. I'm comparably situated to Nicole, although I think my institution and me and my position are a little further behind in our journey. So I'm the first, as Alex said, the first Chief Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Officer at the National Gallery of Art. This is a position that was created last year. Been in the job about 7.5 months now. I'm working for Director Caitlin Feldman, who came into the gallery in 2019, March of 2019. So she's just been in her job about 2 years. And she was hired, to really, she's the 5th director of the National Gallery, the first woman, and was hired with a mandate to really put the national back in National Gallery and to carry on what Nicole was saying, about accountability to the people paying the bills. We're a federal institution. We were founded in 1941 or opened in 1941. We were a gift to the nation from the financier Andrew Mellon, who gave the money to build the building and gave his art collection and encouraged other collectors to do the same. And the deal was that Congress would continue to appropriate funds to support the museum's operations in perpetuity. And so we get about 80% of our funding every year from Congress, and the other 20% comes from private sources. And our collection, the collection that Andrew Mellon had, and the collections of the other collectors who also donated to the Young Museum. It's primarily a collection of European and American art. We don't have any collections of Indigenous art, of the African continent, of the arts of Asia per se. So, that's just what we've got, and that's sort of always been what we've got. And the collection has been built entirely with private funds and private donations. But there is still this sense of accountability that we are the National Gallery, and how do we carry out that mission with the collection that we have. Where it's about 150,000 objects, 160,000 objects. And let me look at my notes here, at last count, or these figures are about a year old now, but of those 60,000 odd works, 92% of them were made by artists who were male, 98% of them were made by artists who are white. And so, we are making efforts to diversify the collection, especially in the modern and contemporary field, and in the photography collection, and modern prints and drawings. Those are areas where we have more opportunity to do that. But that's really only part of the story, right? And so how do we tell different stories about the works that we have, and how can a sort of robust and responsive collections management system help us do that? I don't think that we'll ever have those collections, of Asian art, of Indigenous art, of art of the African continent. So, when we look at the collection that we have, it is arguably more suited to the kind of traditional Cmss that was conceived for this type of traditional collection. But even within that, there's things that I'm interested in, I'm curious about. Like my first priority is really about the sort of looking at our internal culture and sort of developing and diversifying the workforce and fostering, a more inclusive workplace. My work is less focused on the collection at this point, although it's something that I, will have some involvement with, and, we'll be working closely with our new chief curator, who was just announced last week, or was it even earlier this week, Carmen Ramos from the Smithsonian American Art Museum will be our new Chief Curatorial and Conservation Officer starting later this summer. And she'll obviously be a key partner to me in sort of thinking about that. But one of the things that my director has asked me to do is to think about, our collections data and is it telling us everything that we want to know? And it's harder than you might think. It's a straightforward question to say, well, how many works do we have in the collection by African American artists? And I guess the answer when that question was first asked was, well, we're not entirely sure. Like we don't track, like we can't run a report that will tell us that because we haven't historically tracked that. We have a list, we have an object package, of the artists who we believe to be African American, similarly for other ethnic and racial minorities, but it's not something that we've historically tracked. And then you get into questions of like, okay, well, if we start to track it, what will be the source of the information, and how will we know, right? And what are the issues and the sort of ethics of assigning racial or gender identities to people who may not share them or who can't speak now for themselves? So many of the artists in the collection are deceased. So there's a lot of really interesting issues to look at there, and we've only really just started to scratch the surface of that. But I would say, my job is really to work across the organization to try to help every division, every department embed these ways of thinking into their work. We have just, as the National Gallery, sort of rebranded ourselves with a new mission statement, a vision statement for the first time, a set of our institutional values, and a set of 4 strategic priorities that are going to guide our work going forward. And that vision statement is of the nation and for all the people. And, when you look at what all the people looks like, in 1940, when the gallery opened, the census data showed an America that was almost 90% white. The 2020 census, shows a population that's 60.2% white. And projections are that by 2045, we'll be majority non-white, and that rate of change is accelerating. Non-white Americans are on average significantly younger than white Americans. There's who America is and what all the people looks like is very different now. And how do we reflect and attract a nation that looks more like the actual nation? And that includes ourselves, our programming, to the extent we can, the story, our collection and the stories that we tell. And diversity, equity, access, and inclusion is one of the values that we've specifically articulated. And so looking at, like Kara said, sort of what can a museum of the 21st century be in terms of welcoming all people. One of our strategic priorities is to provide a visitor-focused experience, and that sort of relentless focus on people, welcoming all people and celebrating and giving people an opportunity to experience and explore our shared humanity. That's our new mission statement. And sort of so turning that lens onto the visitor, onto our audiences, onto that concept of shared authority is a big shift for us. But it's something that has a lot of support from our board on down, and my job is to really see how we can carry that forward. So I'm optimistic. But I recognize the challenges, and I, share a little bit of Nicole's pessimism about, the broader structures in the society that we exist in, and how much change can we make within our sphere. The things that we have control over are the things that we have to focus on.
Thank you, Mikka. And I appreciate your honesty and Nicole's honesty with where your institutions are currently. Now, Mikka, I know you had questions yesterday after I dry ran, so if you want to start with those.
I'm really interested to hear more, from maybe starting with Kara about the that process of consultation, you know, and sort of the shift that that has entailed for curatorial staff, or for, you know, for museum staff generally, who are accustomed to thinking of themselves as the authorities, right? Like we collect this stuff because we've decided that it's important, or, you know, it tells a story, and we're going to decide what that story is, and we're going to tell you why it matters and why you should care about it. And that, which is, you know, that's sort of how a lot of museums have been. And so that shift of recognizing other kinds of authority and recognizing other voices, and uh, is a big shift. And so how did you make that? And, you know, how, you know, had NAGPRA obviously telling you you had to do these certain things, but it sounds like it went deeper than that. And so I'm curious to hear more about that process.
Sure, yeah, and the process, I think it hits the individual person a great deal. So because, you know, it's a lot of a combination of like, how were you trained? Were you classically trained in this way? So, and like, who were the people giving you the information, and how deeply embedded is that within the core of your, you know, professional experience? So there's that aspect of it. But then also in hearing, you know, how Indigenous communities have been, you know, making this call for literally decades, if not decades, at least hundreds of years. It is taking that step to like recognize that we don't know everything. And I think it takes that first, like, one person or like one department to be like, you know what, we don't know, you know, and what, and then how do we know? How do we get to know? Well, we get to know by having an actual conversation. And when you were asking about like the consultation process, I mean, before it was, all right, these are, you know, a community would request an inventory. We would provide what we thought might be appropriate. Now, does that mean that everything that may or may not be associated with that community was provided? No, I think oftentimes we would say, no, we think we know that these are sacred, these are cultural patrimony, this is this, this is this, this is what we have. And then we would only provide that information. And instead, what it was taking a shift towards, instead of providing a list of only the things that we think, or the cultural resources we think are applicable under NAGPRA, is why don't we share the list of everything that we have that may or may not be associated with your community? And that's a much more extensive process, which then increases the timeline for consultation, which means we have even more time to talk with the community members and actually ask them, are these items, you know, culturally significant to you? If so, why are we supposed to know that information? And starting to kind of really ask these questions of ourselves. I was like, well, why do we know this? Why do we think we know this? And where is this information coming from that we think that we are the authority in it? Because you do gain a lot of knowledge in doing this work, but you always have to remember that you are not the only authority. Like, you share authority, and in some instances you have to step back and listen to those who actually do know. And it's been a long process, and there isn't any one great way to do it, but really I think just having an open and honest conversation, and admitting that we don't know everything, and we know we don't know everything, is a really huge, big, you know, first step in that transition, I think. Also, I think some of our staff members were able to, because our local Kumeyaay community, they have a community college, and some of us were able to actually take classes at the community college, and it's based on, you know, their Indigenous perspective, and teaching courses about their history from their standpoint. And so being able to take part in a history course that is like that, rather than, you know, having a Western perspective about the history of an Indigenous, you know, community, it's the community talking about themselves, and taking part in some of those classes, and that just opens your brain up even further. So it's really like the individual person, staff members really doing the work, but then it being backed up and supported by leadership saying, oh, you want to take a class to learn more about this? Great. We need to have these consultations in a longer, you know, timeline to get the consultation done. Okay, let's do it. And then it just kind of snowballs and builds from there. I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah.
that's sort of how it kind of worked through.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the whole listening and humility piece is
Yes.
huge, right? For a museum to sort of just acknowledge, like, we are the experts in some things, but we don't know everything. And that's that is a hard thing for a lot of museums, I think, to sort of allow them make themselves vulnerable that way.
Right.
Yeah, I also think it's a broader cultural shift. Even beyond just my museum, but museums and just our culture of not being as comfortable with messy, and that you want to come off as the authority, and as this authoritative voice, and that you've done this research, and that you've come to the table with a fully thought out proposal. And when you do that, you miss the opportunity for fuller and more authentic engagement in all levels. And that I would really love to see that shift, where it's a much more, for us as a staff, it's much more of a brainstorming conversations, and more just generally generative discussions about how we are moving forward, and that creates a space where you can have this more authentic engagement. I mean, if you're working with an external group on a program, to just come to them and say, well, this is what we want you to do. That's not that's not authentic partnership. You really want to build it. So at all times when I'm speaking to external partners or potential partners, I say, this is my idea, but I don't want to be prescriptive in what it finally looks like. What do you want? What do you need? And then bring that back and say, okay, how can we make this work, and have those conversations. When you feel as though you're the only authoritative voice in the room, then you're missing out on everything else. And that just is really speaking from all levels. And also, this is about Cmss, and I should preface, which I didn't, but I am not a Cmss user, for all those people out there. But that, I think you also need to create space of how you talk about your collection, and how your Cmss can embrace that, flexibility, and, just broadly, just a messy nature of information, that is really reflective of how the world is, and gives that deeper, more complex understanding of the objects in your collection.
Mm-hmm. I used to be a more robust CMS user in my previous museum jobs, but it's been a long time since I was a robust user. But it does occur to me that a lot of this, when I look at records now, I've been trained to sort of treat them as authoritative, and you see like there's this information and you don't question it. And so maybe, one of the things that CMSs could do to sort of support this work is to create more highly developed ways to identify sort of the provenance of information, or to make it clear sort of where things happened, or require that more of an audit trail sort of on individual pieces of data, and because you often you get the record and you just I find myself now, wearing the hat that I wear, like asking, where did this information come from? Why? How do we know? And like, maybe just higher cataloging standards, or, a system that supports more validation of data, or explanation of, how it's meant to be used. I recognize that gets more complex. And as Kara said, if there has to be some consistency of sort of like where everyone's putting the information, or else it doesn't do you as much good. But Nicole, what you're saying reminded me of another thing that comes up a lot, is just like this sort of tendency towards perfectionism, right? That really inhibits that kind of open dialogue, and that vulnerability, and that ability to have those conversations, because you feel like you don't want to go to anyone exhibiting these vulnerabilities, or you feel like you do need to have it all figured out before you go to anyone. And that I'm finding in a lot of areas, at the gallery, that sort of mindset, that relentless focus on, perfectionism is inhibiting a lot of work. And, I think that at the extreme end, you're so worried about being perfect that you decide that what you'll be perfect at is not doing anything, you know, and just kind of letting the status quo continue.
And I think, yeah, I can agree with that. You can, I think, I don't know who said this, but don't let perfect be the enemy of good, essentially. And for us, it's about like trying to embrace that, because we know that nothing is ever going to be perfect. And really it's about the honesty and the vulnerability of being truthful about what we do and don't know, and being honest and truthful about where the information that we have in our records and in our database came from. And sometimes we have to be honest and be like, we don't know who attributed this culture. We have no idea, you know, because we've been around for 100 years and it's gotten messy, you know. So that's a huge concern, is don't let, you know, perfection be the enemy of good, because there's a lot of work to do, and you can't let that quest for perfection stop you from getting the work that needs to be done. So it's a tricky balance for certain.
You also both mentioned how, or you know, Nicole mentioned how it's, you know, we're trained as a society, as a culture, to not want to talk about these messy things, or to talk about race, or to, you know, sort of that it makes us uncomfortable. And that's by design. You know, the sort of powers that be don't necessarily want you talking too much about race, because there's this, you know, this myth that it's sort of, race isn't, you know, the way that we've centered whiteness so that it becomes the norm. It's just so normalized, and everything else is seen as other. But I wonder, you know, so just sort of getting again at that sort of reluctance to have these messy questions, and sort of the idea of curatorial authority lets you avoid a lot of that, just because you can say, well, I'm the expert and I'm going to say, and we're not going to engage in debate around this idea. So how do you, and I wonder if both with the African American working group and in the sort of consultation process with Indigenous tribes, if you've encountered situations where there's disagreement among a community or between communities about like whether a cultural resource is of one or the other, or what the access protocols should be, or, you know, what direction to go in, and those kinds of, you know, facilitating that plurality of views is something that I feel, again, that the museum, the traditional museum, and sort of ones that I've worked in, you know, not well equipped to have those kinds of discussions. So I wonder if either of you have instructive stories to tell in that regard, or, you know, sort of guiding principles around dealing with dissent or differing opinions within the communities that you're trying to work with.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Well, actually, I was going to, I don't know if I'm going to answer this, Mikka, but I was going to direct it to Kara, because as you were speaking about the images that you, how you treat images within your CMS system, and more broadly, and this is a conversation that you know, we're just starting to dive into. But it's this tension, and we spoke about this yesterday, but this tension between the desire to have the collection open and transparent, and you know, these are the works, and this is what we have, and that we are here to serve the public, and so we need to ensure that the public can access these objects. But then we have some incredibly inherently racist objects, and I can't help but feel this tension between the desire to serve that mission of sharing these works with the public, and the need to also not continue to perpetuate the sins of the past. And that at what point, you know, do we say that these racist objects are too harmful, that we need to treat them differently, and that they shouldn't just be on view for public consumption because they have perpetuated the system that we're trying to deconstruct and break down. And so I'm wondering, Kara, if you can speak more to how you've treated these images in your collection.
Sure, I'll do my best. It's a broad topic for a broad question. I appreciate it. So for us right now, we actually have a moratorium on access, because for the longest time, anyone and everyone could just request images, they could do whatever, they could access and do research, you know, if we as the authority and, you know, owner gave permission. And so what we decided, at least for this period of time, we don't have an end date on it yet, is to, we've just kind of stopped having like researchers come in unless it's an Indigenous researcher researching their own community, you know, or if there's a researcher that's doing, that has the permission of the community to come in and do access. But with regards to the images, it's really, we've really kind of honed in around, are these images what the community wants up for public access? And I know when we kind of, you know, took some things down and you know, some members of the public were like, where are the images? Can we have access to? Once we kind of started explaining what our ethos is and why these images are now essentially restricted and not for visible use by the public just because we have them, it you know, for the most part, you know, folks understand why we don't have images available, certain images available for public consumption. Now, that doesn't necessarily answer the question around, you know, like we have, you know, a kind of a, we're not a publicly funded institution, we are a private, technically, museum, even though we are not for profit. So we have a little bit more leeway in what we can and can't do. For those who have a government or a legal mandate for this information to be public, you know, consumption, I mean, there's not a lot that you can do, you know, around that. But I think the best thing that can be done is that consultation process is are these supposed to be up? And I think there's some really good examples of that through the Library of Congress and the Passamaquoddy. I believe Murukutu actually has a really good example of what consultation around images and cultural resources can be. I believe I may be butchering this, and please, Jane, Dr. Anderson, if you're here, please correct me. They did this project with the Passamaquoddy people and the Library of Congress, who held a lot of their images. And essentially what they did was they consulted back and forth, and the records and the database that was up with the Library of Congress was real basic, very westernized. And through this consultation process, they were able to kind of come back and forth, update the records, update everything, give the appropriate, you know, cultural affiliation, do all of this. And so it actually reflects back in their website after having that consultation process. So now not everything in the Library of Congress has gone through that consultation process. Obviously, much of what they have done is still very much up, you know, for the public to view. But there are examples where that can happen. It's just a really slow process, unfortunately, because it is, you know, individual people having to put in the time, put in the effort to do the data updates and all of that. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's kind of one example that comes to my mind about how digital images and other records can be accessed by the public after the consultation process has been done, essentially. So sorry if I kind of scattershot that a little bit.
There's a couple questions, one in the chat and one in the Q&A, that they're a little bit related. They get at about sort of assigned presumed identity versus, you know, one that's sort of self-identified.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you can see that in the Q&A, you know, sort of, what about using a term like presumed white for deceased artists when it's unlikely we'll find documentation that the person was considered or considered themselves white? And then a similar question in the chat around, like, have there been discussions about being transparent when an identity is, you know, assigned versus one that's sort of confirmed by the culture or by the artist? And I wonder, like, Kara, maybe you've got examples in your collection of, I mean, are there cultural resources at the Museum of Us that where you still don't know? Or you know, you haven't had any kind of consultation or involved with the actual presumed community, and are you transparent about when you've, you know, when a attribution is sort of with the consent of the culture at issue, and when it's just a legacy?
Right. Yeah. No, that's something we come across every single day, you know, just by nature of being around for as long as we've had. Communities have changed their names, you know, so it can be really difficult to kind of parse through that, especially like with the presumed. So we use, when speaking about persons, we have sometimes used that like in captions or in parentheses, presumed, this person's name presumed Kumeyaay, or potentially, affiliated with this community, when we kind of know, but we haven't had the chance to do that level of consultation. But when we have had that, level of consultation, there are still, even within the communities around, cultural resources that just say, for example, in Southern California, you have the mission system. So we may just have dozens of baskets that just say Mission Indian on them. And there are some instances where communities, especially if there's, overlap between traditional territories, where they can come in and take a look at the baskets. And sometimes they can even tell by the weaving who did it and what community they belong to, but that's kind of rare and in between. So a lot of the times we can sort of group based on what you see in some of the attributes, but oftentimes, once the consultation is processed, we are still often left with several cultural resources that have a murky history. And then that's part of that transparency, is when we're documenting the consultation process, we're like, all of these were consulted upon, these were identified as being from this community, the remainder are still in question and could possibly be, but at this point we do not know. So through consultation, while many questions are answered, it does often bring up even more questions about what attribution is like, so. And then I see another question that says, how do you think about identity information and search versus display fields? Have there been discussions about identifying identities as museum assigned versus self-described?
Yeah, I think that was related to what we were just,
yeah.
but
Okay.
There's a couple other questions for you here about works that aren't, that the community is, it says works that a community is not comfortable with. I guess that means not comfortable with you showing, but not something that they want back. I'm sort of inferring. What do you do with those?
Right. So not comfortable with, that could be either not comfortable receiving back because the way in which it was extracted from their community is causing chaos, and they do not wish to have further chaos visited upon their community, is one thing. So there's ways of having temporary curation agreements, or just agreements of stewardship, where if the community wishes, to claim ownership, we can deaccession. If it's not an AGPRA item, we can deaccession it, and then we can still hold it as kind of a loan, but it's not a loan. And then continue to hold it in that way for the community indefinitely. But there are other instances where the community members, and let me kind of come back to the question real quick, so I'm reading it. Sequestering is where they're held and sequestered. It really does depend, because often sequestering separates a cultural resource from its other items that are associated with the community. And how we like to store whenever possible and steward is like, not just like item with like item, but community items grouped together as much as possible, so that they are kind of together and experiencing this together. There are some instances where, we don't have the space to store everything all together. So we sometimes do have to separate out, but, we try to basically follow what the community requests of us whenever possible. It's kind of murky a little bit, but essentially, whatever the community asks of us is we try to perform and do. Sometimes things are deaccessioned, sometimes they are repatriated via NAGPRA, sometimes they just remain here. It just really depends on what the community wants. And when they express that discomfort, it is our job to ask, what can we do to alleviate the discomfort? Is there anything that we can do? Or is this just the state, of discomfort that you have, and you've expressed it and we've heard you? Sometimes that's all it takes, is them just saying, we don't like this, but we know where it stands. So it's complex.
So can I just to add, and probably going further back to the previous question, Kara, because your collection is so based in working with Indigenous cultures and As I shared, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, we did not have a history of collecting works from Indigenous peoples, artists, artisans, makers. But what we do have is we have a significant holdings of early American as in once, the settlers came over and brought enslaved Africans and others to this land. And so we have significant works that were made in whole or in part by enslaved labor, by Africans. And you may have read in the papers around the country that we just opened new early American galleries. And we've done significant work to retell a more inclusive narrative of how the United States of America came to be, with the connecting of, the people who were here and the Europeans and the Africans who were brought over, and Latin Americans, et cetera, this, mixing of cultures. But it's interesting when you have works by enslaved, works that were made by enslaved labor where you aren't necessarily able to attribute to that labor, but still very much those were the artisans and the makers. And so and we've done significant work to try to peel out those narratives, but I think there's still, conversations about how how we can share this information within CMS. For instance, if you don't know the artist because it was an enslaved maker, and that so now the artist is unknown, but you can attribute the work to a certain location, and basically you can infer that this was a Black person. How can you track that information? And I think that I would love to see in the future our museum and others spend significant work in the same respect of having someone who does provenance research for the early 20th century to really go back and look at our collection and other collections, more broadly speaking, of the works that were made by people freed and enslaved Black labor, and how do we deal with those objects? What do we say about those objects? How can we tell a more pronounced narrative about the connections of the connection between our collection and slavery? So those are some conversations that we're just starting to, have and to percolate, really as a result of this work of bringing about these new early American galleries.
So I see another question for Kara about the change process at your museum and the strategies you use to convince stakeholders to implement policy changes, make them official, permanent, and public. What kinds of challenges arose?
Yeah, I think earlier in my presentation, I sort of talked a little bit about, some of the challenges that arose with our board members, both past and present. And those are actually some of the same questions that are brought up by the public, and so really, for us, it was trying to think creatively, what could the public possibly ask us, from the most basic to the most kind of, conspiracy theory questions that might come up. And what we ended up doing was we actually kind of created an FAQ, and I think it's on our website as well, that kind of addresses some of those very basic questions about, well, what is this? Why are you doing this? Why is this important? And then having kind of not rebuttals, but like well thought out responses to the why of how we are doing that. Also, by posting it on our website, it holds us publicly accountable so that if we aren't, doing what we're supposed to be doing, people will call us out, and then we have to kind of address that and deal with that and make sure that we are following through. As far as other stakeholders, what we're finding, especially in like the climate that this country is in right now, and hopefully will continue to be and press forward and get better, is people seem to be, at least in general, at least beginning to be more open to having these conversations. Before it was quite closed, and you kind of had to really appeal to like the individual humanity of folks and to like get them to see why through those case study reviews, through those like conversations. And oftentimes it was about going back to the person or to the stakeholder at different points and helping them along in their journey. I think we have, in particular, we had one board member who was a volunteer downstairs in our cultural resources department as an archaeological volunteer, and like watching her journey as she's grown, you know, from a more traditional board member to a person who is an advocate for this work has been tremendous. And it starts with it's really finding that common ground. What is that thing that you're most interested in and why? And then walking through those conversations with them. And it's a lot of emotional labor as well, I have to state, for staff, especially BIPOC staff. So really it's about talking to people at the individual level and making that change there, and then building it and building it and building it. And we also recognize that we're not going to win over everybody. That's not where we are as a country. We are quite divided, as we all know. So, you know, kind of picking and choosing your fights on where you need to be. So that's kind of it, is that transparency and public accountability, and then, you know, figuring out meeting the person where they are in their journey, and helping them to the next step, and realizing that we may not always be able to help them all the way to the end. That, you know, our work may just be helping them to the next step, and being okay with that, if that answers the question to some degree.
Yeah, and that's, I think, I mean, that is, you know, what we're doing, what I'm doing certainly in my job, sort of that's part of it, is sort of what's the change narrative? Why are we doing this? And getting people to, well, if not agree, at least to be able to say what we believe the diagnosis of the issue is, you know, because I think, unlike, you know, I had the opportunity to hear from the former CEO of Best Buy recently, Hugh Bergeau-Lee, who does a lot of talking and or speaking, you know, public speaking, and has written books on sort of change management and purpose-driven leadership. And you know, the story of Best Buy, it was going out of business. There was no debate about it. It was very easy to tell. But with the museum field, you know, someone might walk into like the Philadelphia Museum of Art or the National Gallery and look around and say, "Oh, this is great. Everything. What is the problem? Like, there, you know, why do you need to change this?" And I think, and that is incumbent on us to really, you know, articulate that, and to be guided, like explain why, you know, we can't achieve our mission vision without this change. We can't, you know, these are the values, that this is how we're going to live them. It is going to involve change. And as Nicole said, change means actually changing. It actually means doing things differently. But I think that's a big piece of it that you know, sounds like was core to what you were doing, sort of like being really thoughtful and concise about the why, and pushing that message forward. And that's sort of where we're still at. It's like, I feel, at the gallery, of, you know, why and how do we push that out, and how do we convince as many people as possible? How do we help as many people as possible on that journey? We're just starting on that.
Exactly.
But you're right, it's never going to be like a universe, you know, nobody, it seems, as you note, there's nothing that everybody agrees on anymore, if there ever was. Alex, do you want to pull out questions or, you know,
Yeah, we're getting a few more in here, actually. We have a question around, has your use of descriptive metadata about people and groups in your collections management systems evolved during this time? And if so, how have you made determinations of what terms to use?
Right. I can take that one. So it's evolved somewhat. And when I was talking about like changing culture names and things of that, so I can kind of give an example around our local community, the Kumeyaay. In our database, they were listed about 1 million different ways from Sunday, with not only just incorrect spelling, but they've been known as different, you know, community names like Santigito, Human, several other, you know, cultural groups that, you know, weren't correct. And it was through, you know, having that conversation of this is the name, this is what it needs to be, and then making those changes. And then Also, and it's as simple as like ensuring that we're not saying, you know, the Kumeyaay tribe. No, it's the Kumeyaay Nation. That is their name. That is what they prefer to be called. So having some of that change has been slow going, but we've been getting it into the system. But making those determinations, as we've kind of said, it kind of comes through all of our consultation process. We may think, you know what, I think it's probably going to be this name. But until we know for sure, you can only put that as, possibly, or, potentially, in brackets, until you have that consultation process. So if you know what the name probably is going to be, so for example, I think we have several cultural resources that are associated with the Raramuri in Mexico. And in our database, it was all called Tarahumara. That's not what they want to be called. Their preferred name for themselves is Raramuri. But have we had consultations with that community? We have not had consultations with that community. But in doing research, because I think I had a question, I was like, is this the right name? Is this right? Because I was seeing some different conflicting information, and then I kind of went down a rabbit hole of research and found some information that was produced by community members saying, no, this is our name. I felt comfortable saying at this point, we should probably switch from Tarahumara to Raramuri, but there is a notation in our CMS that says this is a pending, cultural affiliation or a cultural name, pending consultation with the community, so that we know that, this is where we are at, and like who made that decision, why that decision was made, and being transparent about that when we are able to have that consultation process. So it's a beginning step of recognizing this is probably what the name is. We can probably go ahead and change it in our records and in our database, but we need to note that we have not yet had consultation around that. So that's kind of one area where we're growing and trying to get our legs up underneath us a bit more.
Thank you, Kara. We have another question from Jenny. She mentions that Nicole raised an issue about artworks or objects that depict people in racist or stereotyped ways. I'm interested in hearing more about how we could begin to address that in the collections management system. And Kara, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the customizations that went into your database. I know I'm, as a database nerd, very interested in learning more about that too.
Sure. Nicole, did you want to answer or did you want me to address? Okay. So how we've been trying to address that is challenging. I think a lot of our records, it's more about like the description of the item in particular. So for example, there was an image, a famous image of a local Kumeyaay leader who has since passed, but it's been used in a lot of publications and a lot of other areas. But it's an image. It's a black and white image. He's looking straight at the camera, and the original description for this photograph, while not racist, like per se, it was like, Native American man stoically looking at the camera, and it made some grand assumptions about, why, why he was looking this way at this picture. And I was like, that does not belong in a description about an image, so what we ended up doing was we took that description and we saved it for historical record keeping purposes. We're like, this is not how you do this. Should be just a description of the image itself, not what your thought process is around what you think is happening. You need to take yourself out of it. This is not about what you think. This is about just what is being shown. And then if there is a question about what is being shown, you place that in the comments and you make a comment about this may be this, but making direct statements that, no, this is this, this is my thought process on this, is something that we've been really working hard to extract out of our records, and then retain in more appropriate historical record keeping places. It's tricky though, because you have to balance, was this something that the donor of the image or the donor of the item said and needs to be recorded, or was this, information that was, come up with by the person who was doing the cataloging? So kind of finding that balance has been interesting, but it's something that we're working towards. And as far as dealing with, and I lost the question, so I can't see the rest of it, but that's kind of what we're working with right now. We don't have anything in our collection that is like directly like racist in its like depictions, because we don't have a lot of fine art. Most of it really is like the cultural resources from other communities. So I can't really speak to that as much. I think that's more of a Nicole question. Not to throw you under there.
No, I think it isn't. I should say the conversation that I've been part of has not been specifically connected to CMS, although I recognize it all goes back to CMS, but more so with how it's displayed on our collections pages on the website.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Great.
that I was just going to say one thing about that this makes me think of is, you know, how just that if you take a step back from this question, you know, what underlies it is the recognition that works of art have impact on people, you know, and that it can be harmful. It can stir up trauma. It can be a very painful experience to see whether it's your cultural resources, you know, displayed in a way that doesn't, you know, is disrespectful or isn't, you know, how you as the community would like to see it, whether it's a depiction of you know, a lynching or you know, and just being able as a museum to acknowledge that and to care about that. You know, I think part of being a museum in the 21st century is that sort of recognition that the impact of what you do matters as much as the intent that you have when you do it. And you know, this is not so much about the CMS piece of it, but just that's just a huge part of it. And being able to be transparent about you know, first of all, that what is being depicted and sort of being transparent about that history and all of that, but also being thoughtful in your process about like, what is the impact of doing this, and do we have a good mission-driven, value-based reason for doing what we're doing? That, you know, just keeping your vision and your values and operating consistently with them as your North Star, I think is probably the best way to go forward, because there will be missteps along the way. But I feel like as long as you're keeping your mission and vision centered and operating in a way that's consistent with your values, you know, then you have a path forward.
Yeah, I mean, to be in an inclusive environment means that it's not just about, you know, diversity and the numbers, but how do people feel when they come in your building? If I'm a Black person and all I see is myself and racist images, do I really feel like I'm included in this space? And so if we are, you know, truly visitor centric and visitor oriented, you need to ensure that, you know, that everyone feels like they are seen and valued within your museum as they walk through the halls. So I'm always thinking, you know, what is the narrative that we're telling, and are we telling a truthful and accurate description of history, and ensuring that while, you know, it may be our history as negative and messy and violent, but we're also showing, you know, that we are the beauty of human life as well. And you have to balance those conversations within the galleries and within the texts. And I think that all goes back to how you manage the collection within the CMS system.
I see a question here that asks, who does this work of reparative collections cataloging fall to at your institution, and how is it prioritized among other museum priorities, even perhaps other DEAI priorities? And at my institution, really it falls everyone who has a hand in working with our database, be it interns, volunteers, you know, staff members. Really, it's about, we kind of start with like basic training in what to expect with the records and the database that we utilize. And we have a lot of call out examples, that one image that I spoke to specifically being one of them. And we kind of have like training that's like, this is how you should catalog following DEAI principles and what to do if you see this. And then always, we have kind of a rigorous checks and balances system of, well, at least in the before times, we're still working to kind of rebuild after, you know, COVID and everything and all of that. But we kind of have a rigorous checks and balance system that's about, you know, ensuring that the work that interns and volunteers might be doing isn't the final step. It's checked by, you know, cultural resources managers. It's, you know, it kind of goes through this process to make sure that they're not just, you know, writing whatever they want, you know, and it is a priority because we have identified inventory work, understanding what we hold as a priority project, at least for our department in particular, and then how it fits in with other priorities, it can flux. And I will be the first to admit that sometimes cataloging, especially at a rigorous standard, can fall by the wayside sometimes depending on the project. But that's where that making sure we are recalling the why of how we do, you know, this inventory process, this cataloging process, and just making sure we're revisiting that on a regular basis, because it's easy to get really bogged into it, but you kind of constantly have to pull yourself up and see it at the higher level of what you're doing and why. So that's kind of my response to that.
All right, I think we have time for one more question before we wrap today. So why don't we take one from Sharon? She's asking, is there or could there be a shared resource of community approved terms?
Shared resource of community approved term. I'm assuming you mean Indigenous community approved terms or BIPOC community approved terms. I think there are some out there, and it's starting to become more prominent, especially from Indigenous led, you know, community centers and museum centers. I think it's starting to get out there. I think the more connected we're becoming as a globe through digital technology, it's becoming quite transformative. But that said, I think we're also fracturing out a little bit, and it's easy to get bogged down into, you know, like the individual of what they need and what they want. And so I think one of the questions we have to think about is when there's community approved terms, like who in the community is making that determination? You know, is it, you know, just, you know, one, you know, member of the community who's not on leadership? Or is this, you know, leadership and culture bearers who have authority by their community and their leadership to be setting these terms? So that's a question that we kind of have to ask as well, is who is making this determination at the community level, and then how are we incorporating that at the institutional level? And it's highly variable depending on what institution you're at, what your holdings are. It's a lot. So there's no one one-stop shop answer for it all. But I think depending, especially if you go by region, I think it's starting to come out a little bit more and a little bit more. So I think in the coming years, you're going to see more information and more accessibility of information for how to do this sort of work.
All right, so we are about at time now. So first and foremost, I want to thank Kara, Nicole, and Mikka for your time today and being so generous with sharing your experiences. Thank you for everyone attending. As you know, this has been recorded, so we will share the recording link on all of our social media channels and listservs. That's it. Thank you, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. It was great.